The engine's rhythmic thrum was Derek Halston's penance, a 2,000-foot wall of sound designed to drown out the memory of the one man he couldn't save. Beside him, Havoc, his Belgian Malinois, was usually a silent shadow. But as they neared the jagged teeth of Phantom Ridge Island, the ritual shattered. Havoc wasn't just alert, he was vibrating. A low, guttural snarl rippled through the cockpit, his hackles rising like a serrated blade. Derek looked down, expecting a stranded boater. Instead, he saw it. H-E-Elp, spelled in massive white stones against the gray sand. His training screamed to land, but his gut, and his dog, screamed a warning. Havoc wasn't baring his teeth at the SOS, he was baring them at the tree line. Derek had spent his life saving people, but as he banked the plane, he realized the victims below weren't waiting for a savior. They were waiting for a target. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe it, you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The introduction, modeled prose, the drone of the Pratt & Whitney engine, was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. To Derek Halston, it wasn't noise, it was a barrier. At 38, his face was a rugged landscape of old scars and new regrets, his eyes perpetually scanning the horizon for a redemption that never quite arrived. For years, these humanitarian runs along the coast had been his maintenance, the only way to pay the debt he owed for leaving Marcus behind in the dust of a botched extraction. Havoc, a Belgian Malinois with the intensity of a loaded spring, sat in the co-pilot seat. He was Derek's early warning system, a partner who could smell a panic attack before Derek even felt his chest tighten. They were a closed circuit, no outsiders, no complications. Then, the circuit broke. It started with a shift in the air. Havoc didn't whine like the dog in the stories. He stood up, his claws clicking against the metal floorboards, and unleashed a sound that made Derek's blood turn to ice. It was a tactical alert, the sound Havoc made when a perimeter was breached. Derek banked the float plane, squinting through the salt-streaked glass. Phantom Ridge Island was a graveyard of pine and granite. It should have been empty, but there, carved into the very skin of the beach, was the word, help. Derek's first instinct wasn't heroics. It was a cold, sharp spike of suspicion. The letters were too perfect, too deliberate. He wanted to pull back, to climb back into the safety of the clouds, and leave the world's messy problems to someone else. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but Havoc fixed him with a look of unwavering, predatory certainty. The dog knew something Derek didn't. Steady, boy, Derek muttered, his hand trembling slightly on the yoke as he cut the throttle. Let's see who's really asking. As the plane descended toward the white-capped waves, the silence of the engine was replaced by a much more terrifying sound, the clicking of a trap being sprung. The de Havilland Beaver tilted its wing, a silver blade slicing through the low-hanging coastal mist. Below, the Pacific Northwest was a study in monochromatic violence, jagged black rocks, deep charcoal water, and the endless suffocating green of the old-growth timber. Derek Halston tightened his grip on the yoke, his knuckles white against the weathered leather. He had passed Phantom Ridge Island 1,000 times. To most it was just a navigational hazard, a desolate shard of granite that seemed to move in the fog. To Derek, it was a checkpoint in his daily ritual of penance. But today, the ritual had been defiled. See it again, Havoc? Derek muttered, his voice gravelly from an hour of silence. Beside him, the Belgian Malinois didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. Havoc was a 70-pound mass of coiled muscle and dark fur, and right now, he was vibrating. The dog's ears were pinned forward, his amber eyes locked on the crescent of pale sand tucked into the island's leeward side. A low, vibrating hum started in the dog's chest. Not a growl of play, but the tactical alert of a predator sensing an interloper in the wire. Derek banked the plane, bringing it down to 500 feet. The HELP sign was unmistakable now. It was a masterpiece of desperation. The letters were nearly 10 feet tall, constructed from sun-bleached driftwood and white quartz stones dragged from the upper ridgeline. It was too organized to be a prank, yet too perfect to be the work of the dying. He scanned the shoreline, his eyes moving in the disciplined, rhythmic pattern of a man who had spent a decade looking for IEDs and snipers. Search the periphery first. Then the center. Then the shadows. Nothing, Derek whispered. No smoke from a signal fire. No orange life rafts bobbing in the surf. No shattered fuselage of a downed Cessna or the splintered remains of a pleasure cruiser. The island was a tomb of silence. If someone had the strength to move those boulders to spell out a 4-letter plea, they should have had the strength to keep a fire going. His internal alarm, the one forged in the dust of Kandahar and sharpened by the death of his best friend Marcus, began to chime. Something is wrong. But then he looked at the medical bag strapped into the rear seat, the red cross patch staring back at him like an accusation. He remembered Marcus's face, pale and bloodless, looking up at him as the extraction chopper hovered just out of reach. He had hesitated that day. He had followed protocol instead of instinct, and he had spent every day since trying to balance the scales. "We're going in, Havoc," Derek said, more to convince himself than the dog. "If someone's down there, they don't have 4 hours for the Coast Guard to wake up." The landing was a feat of mechanical violence. Derek wrestled the beaver onto the choppy water of the cove, the floats slamming against the waves with the sound of gunshots. The engine's roar died away, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the rhythmic slap of water against the aluminum hulls. Silence rushed into the cockpit, heavy and thick. Derek didn't move immediately. He sat, his hands still on the controls, letting his senses adjust. He reached back and grabbed his tactical medical kit, a customized jump bag filled with enough trauma supplies to run a small field hospital. He checked the Glock 19 holstered at his 4 o'clock position. He didn't expect to need it, but Phantom Ridge was a place where the rules of the civilized world felt thin. "Havoc, out," he commanded. The Malinois leaped from the door before the plane had even settled against the sandy shallows. As Derek climbed down, the cold water of the Pacific soaked through his boots, but he barely felt it. He was focused on the dog. Havoc wasn't doing his usual search-and-find routine. He didn't have his nose to the ground, tracking a scent. Instead, the dog stood on the shoreline, his hackles raised in a jagged ridge from his neck to his tail. His head was up, sniffing the air, his body angled toward the dense tree line of hemlock and cedar. He let out a sharp, jagged bark, a warning. "Stay close," Derek ordered, his voice sharp. He shouldered his pack and stepped onto the dry sand. The HELP sign was even more impressive from the ground. The quartz stones were heavy. It would have taken hours, maybe days, of grueling labor to arrange them. Derek knelt by the H, touching a piece of driftwood. The wood was dry, but the sand beneath it was still damp. It had been moved recently. "Hello?" Derek shouted, his voice echoing off the granite cliffs. "I'm a medic. I have a plane. Is anyone there?" For a long heartbeat, the only answer was the wind, whistling through the pines. Then, a branch snapped. Havoc let out a snarl so visceral, it felt like a physical blow. The dog moved in front of Derek, his teeth bared, his entire body trembling with the need to launch. "Havoc, heel!" Derek snapped, though his hand drifted toward the grip of his pistol. From the dark shadow of the tree line, 2 figures emerged. They looked like ghosts, rising from the forest floor. The first was a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, her blonde hair matted with dirt and dried salt. Her face was a mask of bruises, deep purple blooms around her eyes and a jagged, stitched-up cut across her cheekbone. She was limping heavily, her right arm cradled against her chest in a makeshift sling made from a torn flannel shirt. Behind her was a girl, no older than 15. She was pale, her eyes wide and glassy, with the unmistakable stare of a 1,000-yard shock. Her clothes were shredded, her knees raw and bloody. "Please," the woman gasped, her voice a broken reed. She stumbled forward, collapsing onto the sand 20 feet from Derek. "Please, you have to help us." Derek's tactical brain hit the brakes. The soldier in him saw the dog's aggression, the strange lack of a boat, the oddity of the quartz stones. But the medic, the man who was dying of a savior complex, saw the trauma. He saw the way the woman's hand trembled. He saw the genuine swelling in the girl's ankles. He saw the blood. "I've got you," Derek said, his voice dropping into the calm, authoritative tone he used in the back of a Blackhawk. "I'm Derek. I'm a flight medic. You're safe now." He moved toward them, but Havoc let out a roar of a bark, lunging to the end of his mental leash. The dog wasn't just guarding. He was trying to prevent Derek from stepping forward. He was acting as if the woman was a live grenade. "Havoc, knock it off!" Derek yelled. "Sit! Stay!" The dog sat, but his entire body was a vibrating wire of tension. He never took his eyes off the woman. His growl was constant, a low-frequency warning that Derek chose to ignore. Derek knelt beside the woman. The smell of copper and unwashed skin hit him, the smell of a survivor. They killed him," the woman sobbed, clutching Derek's forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into his skin like talons. "My husband. They took the boat. They're coming back. They said they'd come back for Sophia." "Who?" Derek asked, already reaching for a trauma shear to cut away the girl's bloodied leggings. "Who's coming back?" "The men. The woman. Elena." She said her name was whispered. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "They're traffickers, Derek. They have a camp on the other side of the ridge. We ran. We've been hiding in the rocks for 3 days. Derek looked at the girl Sophia. She was staring at Havoc with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. It lasted only a second before she hooded her eyes and returned to her mask of shock, but it was there. Havoc saw it too. He lunged again, a snap of his jaws inches from Elena's face. "Damn it, Havoc!" Derek grabbed the dog's collar, hauling him back. I am so sorry. He's usually not like this. He must be keyed up from the flight. It's okay, Elena said, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at the dog. Animals. They know when someone has been through hell. He's probably just sensing our fear. She reached out a hand, as if to pet the snarling Malinois. Havoc snapped at the air, his eyes wild. Don't, Derek warned, pulling the dog further away. He's a working dog. He's not a pet. He looked back at the HELP sign, then at the two broken women in front of him. His gut was still twisting, a cold, oily feeling that told him the geometry of this situation was all wrong. The injuries were real, yes. The terror seemed real, but Havoc had never been wrong. Not once, not in the 3 years they had flown together. But as Elena leaned her head against his chest, weeping for her dead husband, the ghost of Marcus whispered in Derek's ear, "Don't leave them. Don't be the man who walks away again." Derek closed his eyes for a split second, pushing the dog's warning into a dark corner of his mind. He was a medic. These were victims. That was the only math that mattered. "Can you walk?" Derek asked Sophia. The girl nodded slowly, her movements robotic. "We need to get you to the plane," Derek said, standing up and offering a hand to Elena. "We'll get you to a hospital in Astoria. I'll radio the Coast Guard once we're airborne." Elena took his hand. As she stood, her weight shifted, and for a fraction of a second, the limp vanished. It was a fluid, athletic correction, the kind of movement a trained fighter makes to keep their balance. Derek froze. He looked down at her feet. She was wearing high-end trail runners. They were dirty, yes, but the soles weren't worn. They looked brand new. "Is something wrong, Derek?" Elena asked. Her voice was no longer shaking. It was smooth, dark. Derek looked at Havoc. The dog had stopped growling. He was standing perfectly still now, his ears flat against his head, his gaze fixed on the tree line behind the women. He wasn't looking at them anymore. He was looking at what was coming out of the woods. "Get to the plane," Derek whispered, his hand finally closing around the grip of his Glock. "Get to the plane now." But as he turned toward the cove, he saw the second part of the trap. A black inflatable RIB, rigid inflatable boat, was rounding the point of the cove, cutting off his escape to the beaver. The angels had fallen. And as Derek Halston looked into Elena's eyes, he realized he hadn't landed on an island of survivors. He had landed in a hunting ground. The wind off the Pacific carried a bite that tasted of salt and ancient cold depths, but Derek Halston didn't feel the chill. His world had narrowed to the 5-foot radius around the two women huddled on the sand. The transition from pilot to medic was a physical shift. His shoulders squared, his breathing slowed, and the frantic what-if thoughts that usually plagued his mind were shoved into a small, dark box. In the field, there was only the patient. There was only the trauma. "Easy, Elena," Derek said, his voice a low, steady rumble designed to anchor someone drifting into hysteria. He reached for his jump bag, the heavy nylon thudding onto the sand. "I'm going to open my kit. You're going to see some gear, but it's all for you. Sophia, can you look at me?" The girl didn't move. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped tight around her shins. She was rocking, a rhythmic, haunting motion that Derek had seen in earthquake survivors and IED victims alike. Her eyes were fixed on a point, somewhere 3 miles past the horizon. Classic acute stress reaction. "Dissociation. She hasn't spoken," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned toward Derek. "Not since we saw the fire on the boat. She just stares. Please, is she going to be okay?" "She's in shock, Elena. Her brain is trying to protect itself from what it can't process," Derek replied. He pulled a pair of nitrile gloves from a side pocket, the snap of the blue latex echoing like a gunshot in the quiet cove. As he moved closer, Havoc's growl deepened. It wasn't a bark. It was a tectonic vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The Malinois had positioned himself exactly 3 feet to Derek's left, forming a living barrier between his handler and the women. His teeth were partially unsheathed, the black leather of his lips pulled back just enough to show the gleaming white of his canines. "Havoc, knock it off," Derek muttered, his tone sharpening. "Leave it." The dog didn't leave it. He shifted his weight, his eyes tracking every micro-movement Elena made. When she reached out a hand toward Derek, a plea for comfort, Havoc lunged forward 6 inches, a sharp huff of air exploding from his lungs. "I am so sorry," Derek said, genuinely embarrassed. He grabbed Havoc's tactical collar and hauled him back. "He's a rescue dog, usually. I don't know what's gotten into him. He's never acted like this with victims." Elena shrank back, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "It's okay," she breathed, her chest heaving. He must sense how scared we are. My father used to say dogs are mirrors. They reflect the chaos in the air. We're full of it, Derek. We're covered in it." Derek nodded, though a small, nagging part of his brain, the part that had survived 3 tours, noted the poise in her explanation. But then he saw her arm. He took her wrist gently. The skin was mottled with a savage, multicolored bruise that wrapped around her ulna. This wasn't makeup. He could feel the heat radiating from the soft tissue, the localized edema that only comes from blunt force trauma. He moved his thumb across her collarbone, and she winced, a sharp, genuine intake of breath that whistled through her teeth. "Tell me what happened," Derek said, opening a bottle of saline to irrigate a jagged tear on her forearm. Elena closed her eyes, and the story poured out of her like blood from an open vein. "We were supposed to be on vacation. A charter out of Port Hardy. My husband Thomas, he wanted to show Sophia the whales. But the engine, they said it was the engine. These men, they came alongside us in a black boat. They looked like Coast Guard at first. They had the jackets. The lights." She choked back a sob, and for a moment, she couldn't continue. Derek waited, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he taped a sterile dressing over the wound. "They didn't want the boat," she finally whispered. "They wanted us. Thomas tried to fight. He told us to jump. He threw the emergency bag to me and told us to swim for the light. We saw the island. We swam until my lungs felt like they were filled with glass. When I looked back, the boat it was just a glow on the water. They burned it, Derek. They burned him." Derek felt the familiar, bitter taste of bile in his throat. This was the evil he flew away from, yet somehow, it always found him. He looked at Sophia. The girl's knees were shredded. The dermis literally scraped away from crawling over the volcanic rock of the ridgeline. No one faked that kind of road rash. "We've been here 2 nights, Elena continued, her gaze drifting to the massive quartz stones on the beach. "I moved the rocks. It took me all night. I thought, if I didn't do something, Sophia would just fade away. I had to make the world see us." Derek reached into his pack for a mylar thermal blanket. He draped it over Sophia's shoulders, the crinkling silver fabric, shielding her from the wind. "You did the right thing, Elena. You're a hell of a mother. Most people would have just curled up and waited." "I knew if I could just get a pilot's eye," Elena said, her voice gaining a strange, rhythmic steadiness. "At this altitude, with the sun hitting the quartz, the reflectivity coefficient should have been high enough even in the fog." Derek paused, his hand frozen over a roll of gauze. Reflectivity coefficient? He looked up at her. Her face was still a mask of pain and exhaustion, but that phrase, it was technical. It was the kind of language a search and rescue coordinator or a tactical analyst used. "You a scientist?" Derek asked, keeping his voice casual. Elena blinked, and for a split second, the victim mask slipped. Her eyes sharpened, a flash of cold, calculating intelligence darting behind the tears before she shuttered it. "My husband was an engineer," she said quickly, her lip trembling again. He used to talk about it. I just remembered him saying it once. I don't know why I said that. My head it's all spinning." "It's okay," Derek said, though the oily feeling in his gut was back, stronger than before. "You've been through a trauma. The brain does weird things with memory." He stood up, intending to fetch some water from the plane, but Havoc blocked his path. The dog refused to move, his body positioned like a wedge between Derek and the women. Havoc's tail was tucked slightly, not in fear, but in the bracing position used by protection dogs when they expect a frontal assault. "Havoc, move," Derek commanded. The dog let out a whine that sounded like a tea kettle screaming. He looked at Derek, then at Elena, his amber eyes pleading. "Derek," Elena said, her voice soft. "Your dog, he's a Malinois, isn't he? High drive. Probably KNPV or IPO lines." Derek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Pacific wind. A civilian hiker from a whale-watching vacation wouldn't know the specific European working dog bloodlines. They wouldn't know the difference between a German Shepherd and a Malinois, let alone the acronyms for international protection sports. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her bruises were real, yes. Her daughter's shock was convincing, but Elena was watching Havoc with a professional's eye. She wasn't looking at him with fear anymore. She was measuring his alert posture. "Something like that," Derek said, his hands slowly moving away from the medical bag and hovering near his waist. "You know dogs. I had a neighbor who bred them," she said, but the warmth was gone from her tone. It was a flat, rehearsed line. She looked over Derek's shoulder, toward the tree line. "The wind is picking up. We should get to your plane, shouldn't we? Before those men find the signal." "In a minute," Derek said. He needed to test her. "I need to check Sophia's pupils one more time. Make sure there's no cranial pressure." He leaned toward the girl, but as he did, he deliberately let his medical shears slip from his pocket. They clattered onto the sand, landing near Elena's foot. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, Elena's hand shot out. She caught the shears before they even settled in the sand, her fingers wrapping around the handle with a grip that was practiced. Sure, and lethal. She didn't hand them back like a survivor. She held them like a weapon, the points aimed toward Derek's throat for a heartbeat. Before she realized what she'd done, she immediately let them drop, her face crumpling back into a sob. "Oh God, I'm so jumpy. Anything that moves. I'm sorry." Derek's heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She caught them. No one with a shattered humerus and a torn rotator cuff catches a falling object with that kind of reaction time. He looked at Havoc. The dog was no longer growling. He was silent now, his head lowered, his body coiled to spring. He was waiting for the command. He was waiting for Derek to finally see what he had seen from the air. "The plane," Elena urged, her voice now hard, the motherly desperation replaced by a cold command. "We need to go, now." Derek looked back at the de Havilland Beaver. It sat in the water, beautiful and vulnerable. It was more than a plane. It was an asset, a high-value, untraceable bush plane, capable of landing anywhere on the coast. He realized then that the HELP sign wasn't a plea. It was a lure, and he was the fish. "You're right," Derek said, his voice forced and tight. He began packing his kit, his fingers fumbling with the zippers. "Let's get you to the plane. I just need to grab my flight log from the cockpit. I left it on the dash. Sophia and I will wait by the floats," Elena said, standing up. The limp was back, but it was exaggerated now, a performance for a man she thought she still had on the hook. "We'll be ready." Derek turned toward the water, his back to them, every nerve ending in his spine screaming. He could feel Elena's eyes on him. He could feel the girl, Sophia, watching him like a hawk. He whistled low, a specific frequency. "Havoc, watch." The dog didn't follow him to the plane. He stayed on the sand, his body a silent, furry sentinel between the victims and his master. As Derek waded into the cold water, his mind raced through his inventory. He had a Glock 19 with 2 spare magazines. He had a flare gun. He had a satellite phone. But more than that, he had the realization that the world had just gotten a lot smaller and a lot more dangerous. He climbed onto the float, his boots dripping. He reached into the cockpit, but he didn't grab his flight log. He grabbed his binoculars and looked past the beach, past the help sign, and into the dense green of the hemlocks. There, tucked behind a screen of downed timber, he saw the glint of glass. A lens. They weren't alone. And they weren't waiting for a rescue. The tide was coming in, the cold Pacific fingers creeping up the sand, as if trying to reclaim the stones that spelled out the plea for help. Derek moved with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had built 1,000 temporary bases in hostile territory. He hauled the survival crates from the Beaver's cargo bay, the heavy plastic skidding across the damp sand. He needed to establish a perimeter, but he called it a camp to keep the women calm. Or perhaps he called it a camp to keep himself from acknowledging the war footing his instincts were demanding. "We'll stay here for now," Derek said, his voice projecting a calm he didn't feel. He popped the latches on a ruggedized Pelican case, revealing a portable stove and mylar-wrapped emergency rations. "The water's too choppy for a safe takeoff with the extra weight right now. I need the wind to die down, or the tide to peak. Besides, you two need to get your core temperatures up before we move." Elena sat on a driftwood log, her daughter Sophia huddled beside her under the silver sheen of the thermal blanket. The crinkling of the mylar was a constant, agitated soundtrack to the afternoon. "Whatever you think is best, Derek," Elena said. She looked smaller now, more fragile, but her eyes never stopped moving. They tracked Derek's every move, his hands, his belt, the way he positioned his bag. "We're just so grateful. We thought we were going to die on this rock." Havoc was a shadow 10 feet away. He hadn't sat down. He hadn't paced. He was a statue carved from midnight and aggression, his gaze fixed on the women with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. "Havoc, come," Derek commanded, patting his thigh. The dog didn't move. He didn't even flick an ear toward his master. This was a direct defiance of a command Havoc had obeyed 10,000 times. In the Special Forces, a dog that didn't recall was a liability. On this beach, it was a siren. "Havoc, heel." Derek's voice cracked like a whip. The Malinois let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound of deep internal conflict. He moved 3 inches toward Derek, then stopped, his hackles rising even further. He wasn't being stubborn. He was being a sentry who refused to abandon his post. "He really doesn't like us, does he?" Sophia spoke for the first time. Her voice was thin, reedy, and lacked the melodic lilt of her mother. It was the voice of someone reading from a script they found buried in the sand. She stood up, the mylar blanket slipping from her shoulders. Before Derek could intervene, she took a step toward Havoc. "It's okay, puppy. I like dogs. We had a dog back home. A big, sweet golden retriever." She reached out a hand, palm down, the universal gesture of a child trying to make a friend. Havoc didn't wait for her to get close. He didn't growl. He didn't warn. He exploded. The dog snapped, a lightning-fast strike that ended inches from Sophia's outstretched fingers. The sound of his teeth meeting, a hollow, bone-chilling clack, echoed off the granite cliffs. It was a muzzle punch, followed by a warning snap, the kind of move intended to deter a lethal threat without committing to a full bite. Sophia shrieked and fell back into the sand. Elena was on her feet in an instant, pulling the girl away. "Get that animal away from her!" Elena screamed, her voice losing its victim softness and turning into something jagged and sharp. "He's dangerous. He's going to kill her. Havoc, down!" Derek roared. He lunged forward, grabbing the dog's harness and physically forcing him into the sand. The dog fought him, not with teeth, but with pure, muscular resistance. Havoc looked at Derek, and for the first time in their partnership, there was a look of profound disappointment in the dog's amber eyes. It was the look of a partner whose warning was being ignored by someone they trusted. "I am so incredibly sorry," Derek panted, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Sophia, who was sobbing into her mother's chest. He has never done that. He's a certified SAR and protection dog. He's supposed to be rock solid. He's a monster," Elena hissed, her eyes darting to Derek's waist, where his Glock sat in its holster. "You shouldn't have a beast like that around people who are already hurting." Derek stared at his dog. Havoc was pinned to the sand, but his eyes were still locked on Elena. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the mist raced down Derek's spine. He was torn. In the civilian world, Havoc's behavior was a lawsuit waiting to happen, the sign of a broken, aggressive animal. But in Derek's world, the old world, Havoc was the only one who didn't lie. The memory hit him then, unbidden and brutal. Kandahar, 2018. The dust was so thick you could chew it. Marcus was leading the way into a mud-walled compound. A woman had come out, screaming that her child was burned. She was crying, clutching a bundle of rags, her face a mask of maternal agony. Derek had stepped forward, his medic bag already open. His gut had told him the compound was too quiet. The village dogs were howling, miles away, sensing the wrongness. But the protocol was clear. Help the local nationals. Build the trust. Marcus had looked at Derek, hesitant. "Something's off, D. She's a mother, Marcus. Look at her." Derek had reached for the child. The bundle of rags wasn't a baby. It was a pressure plate. The explosion had been a dull, thudding whump that threw Derek 10 feet back. When the dust cleared, the mother was gone, and Marcus was lying in the dirt, his life leaking into the thirsty soil. Derek had followed the rules. He had trusted the appearance of pain, and he had buried his best friend because of it. "Derek?" Elena's voice snapped him back to the present. She was standing closer now, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The touch was meant to be comforting, but to Derek, it felt like a brand. "You went somewhere else for a second," she said softly. Her eyes were moist, her expression the picture of empathetic concern. "You have that look, the look of a man who carries too much. We just want to go home, Derek. We want to see our family. We want to forget this island ever existed. Please, can you get us home?" She was playing the one card she knew he couldn't beat, his guilt. She was weaponizing his need to be a savior against his need to be a survivor. "I need to check the radio," Derek said, his voice thick. He stood up, avoiding her gaze. "I'll see what the Coast Guard's ETA is." He waded out to the Beaver, the cold water a welcome distraction. Inside the cockpit, the air smelled of old leather and aviation fuel, his sanctuary. He clicked the headset into place and keyed the mic. "Astoria Flight Service. This is Beaver November 47 Alpha. Do you copy?" Static. Then, a faint, metallic voice. "Beaver 7 Alpha, Astoria. We have your position on the emergency ping. What's your status?" "I have 2 survivors on Phantom Ridge. 1 adult female, 1 juvenile. Both requiring medical attention for blunt force trauma and shock. Requesting immediate extraction." "Copy, 7 Alpha. We have a Jayhawk diverted from a training mission, but they're dealing with a ceiling drop near Cape Disappointment. ETA is approximately 4 hours. Can you hold position?" 4 hours, Derek repeated, his eyes drifting to the shoreline. Through the salt-crusted windscreen, he watched the beach. Elena and Sophia didn't know he could see them. The change was subtle, but to a man who had spent his life reading body language in kill zones, it was a revelation. Elena was no longer huddled. She was standing near the HE-Elp sign, her posture erect, her head tilted as she scanned the tree line. She wasn't looking for a rescue. She was looking for a signal. Beside her, Sophia had stopped rocking. She was standing by the Pelican case Derek had left open. She reached in, her movements fluid and precise, and pulled out Derek's spare handheld radio. She didn't look like a girl in shock. She looked like a thief. She tucked the radio into the waistband of her shredded leggings and immediately slumped back into her traumatized seated position, as Elena signaled her. Derek's breath hitched. The shock is a mask. He turned his attention to Elena. He picked up his binoculars, the high-powered glass bringing her face into sharp focus. He looked at the bruises he had just treated. Under the harsh, flat light of the overcast sky, he saw the perfect nature of them. The bruising around her eye followed the orbital bone too perfectly, as if it had been applied with the deliberate care of a makeup artist using a reference photo. And the blood on Sophia's knees, it wasn't clotting. It was the same shade of bright, oxygenated red it had been 20 minutes ago. In this humidity, real blood would have darkened, turned tacky. This was moulage. Tactical stage makeup. Beaver 7 Alpha, do you copy? The radio crackled. I copy, Astoria, Derek said, his voice now a cold, dead iron. 4 hours is fine. We'll be waiting. He hung the headset on the yoke. His hands were steady now. The doubt was gone, replaced by the icy clarity of a man who realized he was sitting in the middle of a kill box. He looked at Havoc, still pinned to the sand by his earlier command. The dog was looking at the cockpit, his ears twitching. I'm sorry, boy, Derek whispered to the empty cabin. You were right. You're always right. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a spare magazine for his Glock, sliding it into his pocket. He grabbed a flare gun and 2 red shells. Then, he took a deep breath and stepped back out onto the float. He had 4 hours. He was trapped on an island with 2 professional predators and an unknown number of hostiles in the woods. His plane was the prize, and he was the only thing standing between them and their next paycheck. He waded back to the shore, a fake smile plastered on his face. Coast Guard says they're on the way, Derek lied, his eyes meeting Elena's. But they've got some weather to clear. We've got at least 4 hours of quality time together. Why don't we get some of that tea started? Elena smiled. It was a beautiful, warm, motherly smile. And for the first time, Derek saw the shark behind the teeth. That sounds wonderful, Derek, she said. 4 hours is plenty of time. The mist was thickening, a gray shroud that seemed to swallow the light and dampen the sound of the surf. Derek Halston moved with a deliberate, forced casualness. He knew he was being watched, not just by the victims on the sand, but by the unseen eyes he had glimpsed in the tree line. Every move he made had to be part of the performance. He had to be the weary, compassionate pilot, the man whose heart was bigger than his head. I've got some rations in the emergency kit, Derek said, his voice projecting through the heavy air. Not exactly 5-star dining, but it'll get some calories back into you. You need to keep your strength up. He reached into the Pelican case and pulled out 2 MREs, meals ready to eat, and 2 sealed liters of spring water. He walked toward Elena, but Havoc was there instantly, a silent, furry wedge of defiance. Havoc, back, Derek muttered, placing a hand on the dog's harness. The Malinois relented, but only by an inch, his body still humming with a low-frequency warning. Derek handed the first bottle to Elena. He watched her fingers. He watched the way her eyes flicked to the cap. A starving, dehydrated survivor usually rips the cap off with their teeth, spilling half the water in their desperation. Elena did something else. She held the bottle up to the flat gray light, checking the integrity of the plastic seal. She gave it a subtle, almost imperceptible squeeze to check the pressure, then held it near her nose as she twisted it open, sniffing for the faint scent of bleach or sedatives. It was a clean check, a move drilled into operators who lived in the world of poison and betrayal. Thank you, she said, her voice a soft, melodic purr. She took a small, measured sip, then handed the bottle to Sophia. Drink slowly, honey. Don't shock your system. Sophia took the bottle, but she didn't look at it. She looked at Derek. Her eyes were no longer glassy. They were sharp, assessing the height of his boots, the bulge of the medkit on his hip, the way his weight was distributed. She took a sip and passed it back, her movements as efficient as a machine's. So, Derek said, leaning back against a piece of driftwood, purposefully exposing his neck, a gesture of false trust. That sign, the quartz stones. How long did that take you? I've flown this route for years, and I swear this beach was empty 48 hours ago. Elena leaned her head back, a stray lock of blonde hair falling over her bruised cheek. It was a nightmare. We started the first night. Sophia and we just kept dragging them. I don't even remember how many trips we made. We had to go up to the ridge. That's where the white rocks are. Derek nodded, his expression one of sympathetic awe. Inside, his mind was running the math. The quartz outcroppings were nearly a mile inland and 400 feet up a 60-degree incline. The stones on the beach were the size of bowling balls. To move enough of them to spell help in 10-foot letters would require a team of 4 healthy men with sleds. To do it with a shattered humerus and a teenage girl in shock was a physical impossibility. You're a machine, Elena, Derek said. I've seen Special Forces teams struggle with less labor-intensive tasks. You must have had some serious adrenaline pumping. A mother's love is a powerful fuel, Derek, she replied. She looked at the stones, a faint, proud smile touching her lips. You do what you have to do to survive. I suppose you do, Derek whispered. He stood up, stretching his back until it popped. I'm going to scout the tree line for some drier wood. If we're here for 4 hours, we might as well have a real fire. This damp air will get into your lungs if we aren't careful. Don't go too far, Elena said. It wasn't a request, it was a boundary. The men, they could still be out there. I've got Havoc, Derek said, whistling to the dog. He'll smell them before they see us. As Derek stepped away from the camp, the tension in his shoulders finally began to bleed out, replaced by a cold, tactical focus. He didn't head for the dry wood. He headed for the edge of the crescent beach, where the sand turned to hard-packed silt and salt grass. Havoc knew the mission had changed. The dog's posture shifted from protection to tracking. He kept his nose low, his tail held in a stiff, horizontal line. Find it, boy, Derek whispered. They moved 50 yards down the coast, hidden from the camp by a protrusion of basalt rock. There, in the soft mud near a freshwater trickle, Derek found the first crack in the island's desolate facade. It was a tire track, not a bicycle, not a cart. It was the distinct, aggressive tread of a high-flotation ATV tire, likely an 8-ply radial from a heavy-duty utility vehicle. The tracks were deep, indicating the vehicle had been carrying a significant load, and they were fresh. The edges of the tread pattern hadn't even begun to crumble in the wind. Derek knelt, his heart thudding. This isn't a vacation spot, Havoc. The tracks led directly into a thicket of overgrown salmonberry and devil's club. Havoc didn't hesitate. He slipped into the brush, his dark coat camouflaging him instantly. Derek followed, his hand resting on the grip of his Glock, his eyes darting between the ground and the canopy. They moved inland, the sound of the surf fading behind a wall of green silence. The air here smelled different, not just of damp earth and rotting pine, but of something metallic, something industrial. Havoc stopped. He let out a low, mournful whine and sat down, looking at a wall of what appeared to be solid ivy and moss-covered rock. Derek stepped forward, reaching out a gloved hand. He didn't feel rock. He felt the cold, hard edge of a heavy-duty polymer tarp. He pulled back a corner of the camouflage netting. His breath hitched. Tucked into a natural depression in the hillside was a sophisticated array of solar panels, 6 of them, high-efficiency monocrystalline units, tilted toward the southern horizon. They were wired into a series of lithium-ion battery banks, housed in waterproof, military-grade cases. A thick umbilical of shielded cable ran from the batteries deeper into the hillside, disappearing into a fissure in the rock. This wasn't a survival camp. This was infrastructure. Derek felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. Solar power meant communication. It meant surveillance. It meant that this island was a hub, a node in a network that required constant, silent power. He looked at the cable. It led toward the very ridge Elena had claimed to have scavenged for her quartz stones. He realized then the scale of the deception. Elena and Sophia weren't just lures who had been dropped off. They were part of a permanent installation. The HELP sign wasn't just a signal for him. It was a permanent trap, probably maintained and reset every time a target was identified. And he was the perfect target. A solo pilot, known for humanitarian heartstrings, flying a valuable, high-performance aircraft on a predictable schedule. They didn't just find me, Derek whispered to Havoc. They invited me. He looked at his watch. He had been gone 10 minutes. If he stayed longer, Elena would get suspicious. He needed to get back. He needed to maintain the mask until the Coast Guard arrived, if they were even coming. He began to wonder if his radio call had been intercepted, if the voice on the other end had been a real dispatcher, or just another actor in the play. He quickly recovered the solar panels, ensuring the moss and ivy looked undisturbed. He picked up a handful of damp cedar branches, his excuse, and began the trek back to the beach. As he emerged from the rocks, he saw them. Elena was standing by the pelican case again. She was holding his medical shears, the ones she had caught with such lethal grace earlier. She was turning them over in her hand, the steel gleaming in the twilight. Sophia was standing next to her, no longer rocking, no longer shocked. They were talking, their heads close together, their posture relaxed and professional. When they heard Derek's boots on the sand, the transformation was instantaneous. Elena slumped. Sophia dropped to the sand and began the rhythmic rocking again. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. "Find anything?" Elena asked, her voice returning to that fragile, broken lilt. "Just some damp cedar," Derek said, dropping the wood near the stove. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at her hands. She had tucked the shears into her waistband, hidden by the hem of her shirt. "It'll be a smoky fire, but it'll keep the chill off." "Thank you, Derek," Elena said. "You're a good man. There aren't many of you left." Derek didn't answer. He busied himself with the stove, his mind racing. He had to assume the woods were crawling with armed men. He had to assume his plane was being watched by a sniper. He had to assume that the 4 hours until the Coast Guard arrived was the window they had given themselves to finish the job. Night began to fall, the gray mist turning into a suffocating black velvet. The Pacific Northwest darkness was absolute, a void that swallowed everything but the sound of the water. Derek sat by the small, sputtering fire, Havoc resting his head on Derek's knee. Across the flames, Elena and Sophia were huddled together, seemingly asleep. But Derek saw the way Elena's hand remained near her waist. He saw the way Sophia's eyes remained open, just a crack, reflecting the orange light of the embers. He didn't close his eyes. He couldn't. He reached down and scratched Havoc behind the ears, leaning in close to the dog's head. "I hear you now, boy," Derek whispered, so low the wind carried the words away. "I hear you." Havoc's ears twitched. He let out a breath that was almost a sigh. The dog knew the truth, and finally, the man did too. They were no longer in a rescue mission. They were in a siege. Derek looked out at the dark silhouette of the Beaver bobbing in the cove. It looked like a ghost ship. He realized he might never fly it again. But as he felt the weight of the Glock against his hip, a different kind of ritual began to take shape in his mind. He wasn't the medic anymore. He wasn't the savior. He was the soldier who had survived Kandahar. He was the man who had seen the mother with the bomb. And this time, he wasn't going to let Marcus down. He was going to wait for the first move, and then he was going to burn this perfect trap to the ground. The silence of the island was broken only by the crackle of the wood and the distant, rhythmic throb of a boat engine somewhere far out at sea. Or perhaps it wasn't a boat. Perhaps it was the sound of the trap finally closing. The world was suspended in that hollow, breathless hour before the dawn, a monochromatic landscape of charcoal grays and bruised purples. The fog had moved from a mist to a physical weight, pressing down on the canopy of the Pacific Northwest forest like a wet wool blanket. By the dying embers of the fire, Elena and Sophia were 2 mounds of silver mylar, their breathing synchronized in the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep. Or, as Derek suspected, a very disciplined imitation of it. Derek didn't check his watch. He knew the time by the cold in his joints and the specific tilt of the Orion constellation through a rare gap in the clouds. It was 3:30, the hour of the wolf. The hour when the human soul is at its lowest ebb, and the sentry's eyes begin to play tricks. Beside him, Havoc wasn't asleep. He hadn't been asleep since the floats touched the water. The dog was a statue of dark muscle, his head turned away from the camp, his ears swiveling like radar dishes toward the black wall of the interior forest. He didn't growl. He didn't whine. He simply leaned his weight against Derek's thigh, a silent, heavy pressure that said, "Move." Now, Derek rose with the fluidity of a shadow, his joints silent. He didn't reach for his boots. He had never taken them off. He checked the retention on his Glock, felt the reassuring weight of the spare mags in his pocket, and whistled a frequency so low it was felt rather than heard. Havoc stood, his hackles a permanent ridge of defiance. They left the camp behind, slipping into the tree line with the practiced invisibility of 2 predators returning to the wild. Derek moved in a low, tactical crouch, his eyes scanning the ground through the high-contrast grain of the pre-dawn light. He wasn't looking for a trail. He was looking for the absence of nature. Havoc led him deep into the guts of the island, bypassing the salmonberry thickets and the treacherous, slippery beds of moss-covered basalt. The dog moved with a terrifying certainty, his nose never touching the ground. He was catching the scent on the heavy, damp air, the scent of ozone, of diesel, and of something that smelled like a hospital. They climbed a steep ridge, the air growing thinner and colder as they ascended. Near the summit, where the granite was sheared off into a vertical drop, Havoc stopped. He dropped into a downstay, his body vibrating, his gaze fixed on a massive vine-choked fissure in the rock. Derek pulled his handheld thermal monocular from his kit and scanned the area. The world turned into a neon landscape of oranges and blues. The rocks were cold, the trees were colder, but near the base of the fissure, a steady, rhythmic pulse of heat leaked from a concealed vent. "Good boy," Derek whispered, his heart thudding a heavy, tactical rhythm against his ribs. He moved toward the fissure, his hand hovering near his holster. He found the door not by sight, but by the unnatural perfection of its edges. It was a heavy steel plate, perhaps 3 inches thick, covered in a high-tech ghillie skin, a composite of synthetic moss and crushed rock that mirrored the surrounding basalt with terrifying accuracy. Beside the door, imprinted in a patch of soft, wet clay, was a single footprint. It wasn't the tread of a hiker. It was a Vibram V-Light sole, the specific pattern used by elite military contractors and special forces operators. It was fresh. The edges of the lugs were sharp. The water hadn't yet filled the depression. Derek found the release mechanism tucked behind a loose shard of granite. A pneumatic hiss, soft as a dying breath, echoed through the trees as the door slid back on oiled tracks. The air that hit him was filtered, climate-controlled, and smelled of high-end electronics. Derek stepped inside, Havoc trailing him like a ghost. The interior was a masterpiece of subterranean engineering. This wasn't a bunker. It was an operations center. The walls were reinforced concrete, painted a dull, non-reflective gray. Recessed LED strips provided a dim, red tactical light that preserved his night vision. He moved through the first chamber, his boots making no sound on the rubberized flooring. To his left, a rack held 4 suppressed MP5 submachine guns and 2 Barrett MRAD sniper rifles, clean, well-maintained and loaded. To his right, a stack of Pelican cases held everything from signal jammers to thermal drones. Then he saw the monitors. 6 high-definition screens were mounted in a curved array. They weren't showing the news or weather. They were showing the beach. Derek saw himself, or rather, he saw the thermal ghost of where he had been sitting 10 minutes ago. He saw the fire, a bright white bloom in the center of the screen. He saw the 2 mylar-wrapped figures of Elena and Sophia. But on the second monitor, he saw the perimeter. He saw 3 heat signatures moving through the woods above the beach, circling the camp like wolves around a campfire. They were armed, their movements coordinated, their spacing perfect. On the 4th monitor, his plane, the de Havilland Beaver, sat in the center of a digital crosshair. Data scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Asset value, $1.4 million. Modified. Airframe hours, 3,200. Avionics, Garmin G600 TXI. Target status, secured. Target, Derek whispered, a cold, hard anger crystallizing in his chest. He wasn't a man to them. He was a delivery driver for $1 million airframe. A muffled, rhythmic thumping sound echoed from the rear of the bunker. It was followed by a sound that made the hair on the back of Derek's neck stand up, a thin, jagged whimper that was quickly cut off. He signaled Havoc to stay and moved toward the back of the facility. He passed a small kitchenette and a rack of tactical clothing, identical to what Elena had been wearing, but brand new. He reached a heavy reinforced door with a small, wired glass window. He looked through the glass and felt the world tilt on its axis. The room was a holding cell. In the corner, slumped against a concrete wall, was a woman. She wasn't Elena. She was younger, perhaps 24, her dark hair matted with sweat and filth. Her wrists were bound with heavy-duty zip ties, and a thick piece of silver duct tape was plastered across her mouth. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and dancing with the frantic, jagged energy of someone who had been drugged. This was the victim the HELP sign was meant for. This was Maya. Derek pulled a multi-tool from his belt and moved to the lock. It was a simple magnetic strike. He bypassed it in seconds, the door swinging open with a heavy thud. Maya recoiled, her heels drumming against the concrete as she tried to scramble away. She let out a muffled scream behind the tape, her body shaking with such violence that Derek thought she might go into a seizure. "Easy, easy," Derek said, dropping into a submissive posture, his hands open and visible. "I'm a medic. My name is Derek. I have a plane. I'm here to get you out." He reached out and gently peeled the tape from her mouth. She didn't scream. She leaned forward and vomited a clear, bitter liquid onto the floor, her body racking with dry heaves. They're coming," she whispered, her voice a sandpaper rasp. She clutched Derek's forearm, her fingers digging in with terrifying strength. "You have to get out. You have to leave now." "I'm not leaving without you," Derek said, using the multi-tool to snip the zip ties on her wrists. "Who are they, Maya? Elena and the girl?" "They're hunters," Maya said, her eyes darting to the door. They don't just sell girls. They sell everything. The boats. The planes. They lure people in with the sign. They've been doing it for years. They researched the pilots. They knew you'd come, Derek. They knew about Marcus." Derek froze. "How?" "They have your files. They have your flight logs. They knew you were a hero. They knew you couldn't say no to a woman and a child in trouble." She let out a bitter, jagged laugh that turned into a sob. "Elena, she's not a mother. She's an actress. She was Spetsnaz, Derek. Or something like it. She's the one who kills the pilots once the assets are secured." The horror of it settled into Derek's bones like lead. The perfect bruises. The shock. The way she knew about working dogs. It wasn't just a trap. It was a bespoke assassination. "The plane," Maya gasped, her breathing turning into a panicked wheeze. "The plane is already sold. They have a buyer in Vladivostok. They just need you to fly it to the deep water point. Once you're over the horizon, they dispose of the pilot and the dog." Derek looked at Havoc. The dog was standing by the door, his ears pinned back, his tail tucked. He was looking down the hallway, toward the entrance. "They're here," Havoc seemed to say. "Can you walk?" Derek asked, hauling Maya to her feet. She swayed, her legs buckling. "They drugged me. Something to keep me quiet. I can't feel my feet." Derek looked at the monitors in the other room. On the screen showing the beach, Elena was standing up. She wasn't limping. She was standing by the fire, a handheld radio in her hand. She looked directly at the camera hidden in the trees and gave a short, sharp nod. On the perimeter monitor, the three armed men began to move. They weren't circling anymore. They were converging on the beach. Derek realized then that he had made a fatal tactical error. By leaving the camp, he had signaled to Elena that the prey was no longer under her control. He had broken the script, and the only response to a broken script was a total wipe. "Maya, listen to me," Derek said, his voice dropping into the cold, flat tone of a man who was already dead and had nothing left to fear. "I'm going to carry you. We're going to go out the back way if there is one, or we're going to fight our way to that plane. But you have to stay quiet. No matter what you see, no matter what happens, you don't make a sound. Do you understand?" Maya nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Derek scooped her up, her weight negligible compared to the heavy burden of the truth. He looked at the rack of weapons. He didn't take an MP5. It was too loud, even suppressed. He took a heavy-duty tactical flashbang and a canister of bear spray from the supply shelf. He stepped back into the main operations room. He looked at the monitor one last time. The beach was empty. The mylar blankets were blowing in the wind like silver ghosts. Elena and Sophia were gone. "They're coming for the plane, Havoc," Derek whispered. The dog let out a single, sharp bark, a call to arms. Derek turned and ran for the door, the cold Pacific air hitting him like a physical blow. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, a sliver of bloody red bleeding into the gray. He wasn't a savior anymore. He was a soldier again. And as he looked at the silhouette of his plane in the distance, he realized that if he wanted to save Maya, he was going to have to do the one thing he had spent years trying to avoid. He was going to have to become the monster the hunters were looking for. The air inside the bunker was beginning to feel like a shroud. Derek Halston stood in the center of the subterranean operations room, the weight of Maya's semi-conscious form against his shoulder serving as a brutal reminder of his current limitations. He looked at the monitors, watching the digital ghosts of Elena's team move with a predatory grace that no mere trafficker could emulate. He had spent the last 3 years trying to bury the soldier. He had traded his combat boots for flight deck shoes and his rifle for a medical kit, convinced that saving lives would eventually wash the blood of Marcus off his hands. But as he watched the tactical precision of the men on the screen, a cold, familiar switch flipped in the back of his brain. The savior was dead. He had been a luxury Derek could no longer afford. "Maya, look at me," Derek whispered, his voice losing its soft bedside manner and hardening into a serrated edge. "I need you to listen. The people coming for us aren't just criminals. They're professional. They've been playing a game with me, and I've been letting them win, because I wanted to believe in the best of them. That ends now." Maya's eyes were unfocused, her pupils blown wide by whatever sedative they had pumped into her. The radio," she croaked. "The Coast Guard. They aren't coming," Derek said, the realization settling in his gut like a stone. The timing was too perfect. 4 hours. Exactly enough time for the tide to settle and for them to prep the plane for extraction. That wasn't a dispatcher I talked to. It was a voice on a localized repeater. They own the airwaves on this island. He set Maya down gently on a high-back tactical chair and turned to the equipment racks. The transformation was physical. His posture shifted, his shoulders rolled back, and his movements became economical, stripped of all wasted energy. He was no longer a man trying to help. He was a man calculating a body count. He stripped the bunker with the efficiency of a looter. He didn't take everything, only what was lethal or life-sustaining. He swapped his civilian jacket for a Gore-Tex tactical shell found in a locker, its dark gray fabric designed to disappear in the Pacific Northwest mist. He pulled a chest rig over his head, sliding spare 9mm magazines for his Glock into the pouches. He grabbed a ruggedized tablet from the desk, the intel that held the logs of every pilot they had lured here. It was a digital graveyard, and he would be damned if he'd let his name be the final entry. He stuffed 3 smoke grenades and a pair of high-end thermal binoculars into his pack. Finally, he turned to Havoc. The Belgian Malinois was sitting at the door, his eyes fixed on Derek. The dog's energy had changed. He wasn't whining or leaning. He was in a high-ready state, sensing the shift in his handler. The bond between them, which had been one of companionship and rescue, snapped back into its original configuration. K9 handler and tactical asset. "Havoc," Derek said, his voice a low, guttural command. The dog's ears flattened slightly. "No more rescue. We're in the wire. Guard. Silence. Work." The dog let out a breath that was almost a sigh, his body coiling like a spring. He was no longer a pet. He was a weapon that could think. Derek hoisted Maya onto his back in a modified fireman's carry, securing her with a length of tubular nylon webbing he'd found in the SAR gear. She was a dead weight, an anchor that would slow him down, but she was also the only witness to the truth. "Stay low, stay silent," he whispered to the dog. They exited the bunker not through the front fissure, but through a secondary ventilation shaft Derek had identified on the facility schematic. It was a tight squeeze, the damp concrete scraping his skin, but they emerged 50 yards uphill, tucked behind a massive, moss-covered cedar. The forest was a cathedral of gray light. The dawn was trying to break, but the fog was fighting it, turning the woods into a labyrinth of shadows. Derek didn't move toward the beach. He moved away from it, heading deeper into the high ground. "Counter-tracking, Havoc," Derek signaled with a flat hand. They moved in a jagged S pattern, Derek deliberately stepping on rocks and downed logs to avoid leaving clear boot prints in the soft mulch. He knew Elena's team would have a tracker. He knew they would expect him to run straight for the plane. He needed to make them work for every inch of trail. 10 minutes into the trek, Derek stopped. He lowered Maya to the ground, shielding her with a thicket of ferns, and pulled out the thermal binoculars. He scanned the valley floor below. 3 figures emerged from a dry creek bed. They were moving in a classic, staggered column formation. They weren't wearing the mismatched camouflage of traffickers, or the heavy, clumsy gear of local thugs. They were wearing Cry Precision combat pants, Ops Corps helmets with integrated comms, and suppressed short-barreled rifles. Their movements were fluid, their sectors of fire overlapping with the mechanical precision of a Tier 1 unit. "Ex-military," Derek whispered, his blood turning to ice. "Contractors. Probably Blackwater or Wagner washouts. These weren't men who killed for fun. They killed for a paycheck. And right now, Derek's plane was the biggest bonus they'd seen in a year. He watched the lead man, the point, stop and kneel. The man touched the ground where Derek had deliberately stepped into a patch of mud earlier. The point gestured to the others, a series of silent hand signals that communicated one male, one female, heavy load, heading north. They didn't rush, they didn't shout, they simply adjusted their pace, the 2 flanks peeling off to begin a pincer movement. The hunt was on. Derek was outgunned 5-1 if he counted Elena and the girl. He had a handgun. They had rifles. He had a drugged woman. They had high-speed communications. But Derek had something they didn't. He knew the island's geometry from the air, and he had a partner that didn't need light to see. "Havoc scent check," Derek whispered. The dog sniffed the air, his nose twitching toward the east. He let out a low, vibrating huff. "There's a 4th, Derek realized. "They've got someone flanking the high ridge." He had to move. He hoisted Maya again, his lungs burning with the effort. He used the ghost-walking technique he'd learned in the Q course, rolling his feet from heel to toe, absorbing the sound of the forest floor. He moved through the dense hemlock stands, using the thick trunks as cover. His plan was simple but desperate. Loop back to the beach from the southern cliffs, use the smoke grenades to create a diversion, and get Maya into the beaver. If he could just get the engine turned over, the water was his sanctuary. But as they neared the overlook above the cove, Havoc suddenly stopped. He didn't just sit, he pressed himself into the dirt, his body a silent plea for Derek to do the same. Derek crept to the edge of the granite ledge and looked down. The HELP sign was still there, a mocking white scar on the sand. The fire he had built was a smoldering ruin, but the de Havilland beaver was no longer empty. Elena Volkov was standing on the left float. She was no longer the broken mother. She was wearing a tactical vest, a submachine gun slung across her chest with a professional 2-point sling. She was holding a tablet, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen as she checked the aircraft's avionics through a remote link. Beside her, the girl, Sophia, was sitting in the pilot's seat. She wasn't rocking. She was going through the pre-flight checklist with the bored efficiency of a veteran co-pilot. "They aren't waiting for me to fly it," Derek realized, a cold spike of dread hitting his heart. "They just needed me to land it. They have their own pilots." Then he saw the final piece of the trap. Elena looked up from her tablet, her gaze sweeping the tree line precisely where Derek was hidden. She didn't see him, not yet, but she knew he was there. She reached down and picked up a heavy, long-range rifle, an AIA XMC, and rested it on the wing strut. She wasn't just waiting for the plane to be ready. She was waiting for the savior to return so she could put a bullet in his head and close the file. The de Havilland beaver sat in the water, $1 million prize. Elena had anticipated every move. She had known Derek wouldn't leave Maya. She had known he would come back to his plane. She had positioned herself at the center of his world and turned it into a kill zone. Derek looked at Maya, who was drifting back into a drug-induced stupor. He looked at Havoc, the dog's amber eyes reflecting the cold gray of the dawn. "She's at the plane, boy," Derek whispered. "She's got the high ground, the firepower, and the asset." He felt the old, familiar weight of the mission-ready mindset settling over him. In the Special Forces, they taught you that when you're caught in an ambush, you don't retreat. You don't hide. You break contact by attacking the center of the line. "We're going down there," Derek said, his hand closing around a smoke grenade. "We're going to give them the rescue they've been waiting for. But this time, nobody's playing the victim." He checked his Glock one last time, the metallic clack of the slide sounding like a promise in the morning silence. He had 30 yards of vertical cliff between him and the sand, 3 contractors closing in from behind, and a sniper holding his plane. The savior was dead, the soldier was awake, and the island was about to find out exactly why Derek Halston had been the only one to survive the dust of Kandahar. The descent from the granite overlook was a masterclass in controlled desperation. Derek Halston didn't use a rope, he didn't have the time, and the mechanical whir of a rappelling device would have been a death sentence in the pre-dawn silence. Instead, he used a controlled slide down a chimney of damp rock, Maya's weight a crushing burden against his spine, her arms locked around his neck in a drug-induced grip. Every inch of skin he exposed to the basalt was scraped raw, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the cold, hard tick of the clock in his head. They hit the soft sand of the upper beach 50 yards south of the HE-ELP sign. Havoc was the first to ground, the dog landing silently and immediately dropping into a low-profile crawl. Derek followed, unhooking the nylon webbing and lowering Maya into the hollow of a massive, salt-bleached cedar log that had washed up decades ago. "Stay," Derek whispered to Maya. Her eyes flickered, trying to find his face in the gray gloom. "Don't move. Don't breathe. Just stay in the shadows." He looked at Havoc. The dog's amber eyes were glowing with a predatory fire. "Havoc, guard." "Maya, guard." The Malinois didn't need a second command. He squeezed himself into the hollow of the log beside Maya, his body a living shield, his head turned toward the beach, his teeth already bared in a silent snarl. Derek stood up, his hand resting on the Glock. He didn't hide. He walked out onto the center of the crescent beach, his boots crunching on the white quartz stones of the P in HELP. He wanted them to see him. He needed the focus on him, not the log. The de Havilland Beaver was 20 yards out in the surf, bobbing rhythmically. The cockpit window slid open, and Elena Volkov leaned out. She wasn't holding a rifle anymore. She was holding a satellite phone in one hand and a flare gun in the other. She looked down at Derek with the bored, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen that had refused to die on schedule. "You're a very difficult man to kill, Derek," Elena called out, her voice carrying over the wash of the waves. It was no longer the voice of a grieving widow. It was the crisp, mid-Atlantic accent of an international operative. "I suppose that's the Special Forces pedigree. Most pilots would have been face down in the forest an hour ago." "The forest was crowded," Derek replied, his voice flat. He scanned the tree line. He couldn't see the 3 contractors, but he could feel them. They were moving into their final assault positions. The pincer was closing. "I prefer the beach. Better visibility." Elena smiled, a thin, jagged line in the gray light. "Let's skip the heroics, shall we? My team is 3 minutes from your position. They are bored, they are professional, and they are very well compensated for your head. But I'm a businesswoman, Derek. I value assets more than trophies." She gestured to the plane. "This aircraft is already spoken for. But I can tell my buyer there was a mechanical delay. Here is the deal. Give us the girl. Maya is worth more than the plane, to certain people in the South. You give her to me, you walk to the other side of the island, and you stay there. I'll leave you the emergency raft and enough supplies to last until a real Coast Guard cutter passes by in a week. You get to live. You get to go back to your rituals. You can even keep the dog." Derek looked at the helpstones beneath his feet. He thought about Marcus. He thought about the woman in Kandahar with the bundle of rags. He thought about every time he had traded his instinct for a rule, or his soul for a moment of safety. "I've spent 3 years trying to pay off a debt, Elena," Derek said, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol. "I realized something in that bunker of yours. You can't pay back a life with a ritual. You can only pay it back with another life. And I'm not trading Maya's for mine." Elena's face hardened, the last vestige of her performance evaporating. "A shame. You were almost smart enough to survive." "Sophia?" From the co-pilot seat, the girl, Sophia, rose up. She didn't look like a traumatized teenager. She was wearing a headset, her small, pale hands steady on the controls of the aircraft's avionics. She looked at Derek not with hatred, but with a chilling, vacant curiosity. "Kill him," Elena said into her radio. The world exploded into motion. Derek didn't draw his gun first. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a modified flare canister. He had spent 10 minutes in the bunker's supply room, stripping the magnesium elements from emergency flares and packing them into a pressurized oxygen bottle from his medkit. It was a crude chemical pipe bomb, a sunspitter. He struck the igniter and hurled it toward the tree line, where he had seen the glint of a lens. The canister hit a mossy bank and erupted in a blinding violet-white flash that seared the gray dawn. The heat was so intense it turned the damp needles of the hemlocks into a wall of steam. "Havoc, work!" Derek roared. From the cedar log, the Malinois launched like a black bolt. He didn't go for the plane. He went for the first contractor, the point man who had just emerged from the steam, rubbing his blinded eyes. Derek didn't watch the dog. He moved toward the E and HELP, diving behind a cluster of driftwood, as a burst of 5.56 millimeters fire chewed into the sand where he had been standing. The sound of the suppressed rifles was a rhythmic thud, 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 like a giant heart beating in the fog. He pulled a second improvised device, a heavy-duty medical canister, filled with high-concentration isopropyl alcohol, and a spark gap igniter. He threw it at the second contractor, a man who was trying to flank him from the north. The man caught the canister in mid-air, a professional reflex, but as his fingers closed around it, Derek fired a single shot from his Glock. The bullet shattered the canister. A fireball of blue and orange blossomed, engulfing the man's upper torso. He didn't scream. He was too professional for that. He simply dropped his rifle and dove into the surf, trying to extinguish the chemical fire. 1 down. 2 to go. Derek rolled to his left, the sand stinging his eyes. The third contractor was the professional. He didn't panic. He didn't blind fire. He moved in a low, zigzag pattern, using the H and E stones as cover. His suppressed MP5 held in a rock-steady high-ready position. Derek was out of improvised explosives. He was down to his pistol and his environment. "Maya, stay down," he shouted, though he knew she couldn't hear him over the roar of the blood in his ears. The contractor reached the L. He was 10 feet away. Derek could see the individual stitches on the man's tactical vest. The man leaned around the white quartz boulders, his finger tightening on the trigger. Derek didn't fire at the man. He fired at the base of the quartz boulders. The heavy 9mm rounds struck the unstable sand beneath the stones. The L, which Elena had claimed to have built with a mother's love, was actually a precarious stack of heavy minerals. The vibration of the impacts, combined with the shifting sand, caused the top 3 boulders, each weighing 80 pounds, to slide. The contractor tried to jump back, but the wet sand betrayed him. His boot slipped, and the quartz stones came down like a blunt force guillotine. One caught his shoulder, the other his thigh, pinning him to the beach with a sickening crunch of bone and polymer. Derek didn't stop to check the vitals. He surged forward, his boots throwing up plumes of sand. Havoc. The dog was locked onto the arm of the first contractor, the two of them a whirling dervish of teeth and tactical fabric in the shallow water. The man was trying to reach for a combat knife, but Havoc was shredding, the high-level technique of shifting the bite to prevent the victim from gaining leverage. Derek arrived like a hurricane. He didn't use his gun. He used the weight of his body and the butt of his pistol. He slammed the Glock into the back of the man's neck, a precise, anatomical strike to the C1 vertebra. The man went limp, falling into the surf with a splash. Havoc let go, his muzzle red, his breathing a jagged, rhythmic rasp. He stood over the downed man, waiting for the next command. Derek turned toward the plane, his lungs screaming, his vision tunneling. 2 contractors were incapacitated, and the third was pinned under the stones. He had won. He had broken the pincer. "Elena!" "It's over," Derek shouted, wading into the waist-deep water toward the beaver. "Call them off. Get out of the plane." The cockpit window was silent. The engine of the beaver began to cough, a plume of blue smoke erupting from the exhaust as Sophia engaged the starter. The propeller began to spin, a deadly silver blur that whipped the mist into a frenzy. "Elena!" The door of the beaver swung open. Elena wasn't standing there. She was kneeling on the float, her hands behind her head, her face pale. Standing behind her, holding a suppressed Sig Sauer MCX Rattler with the cold, practiced ease of a seasoned executioner, was Sophia. The daughter. The traumatized child. The girl looked at Derek over the barrel of the rifle. Her eyes were as flat and dead as the Pacific depths. She wasn't the co-pilot. She wasn't the daughter. She was the closer. "You did very well, Derek," Sophia said. Her voice wasn't high-pitched or reedy anymore. It was a low, resonant alto, cultured and lethal. "The stones were a nice touch. Most pilots just try to run for the woods. You tried to use our own stage against us." She nudged Elena with the muzzle of the rifle. My mother is a sentimentalist. She wanted to keep you alive to see the end. I told her it was a tactical error. Sentiment is a luxury for the retired. Sophia shifted her aim. She didn't point the rifle at Derek's chest. She pointed it directly at the cedar log, where Maya and Havoc were hidden. Drop the gun, Derek, Sophia commanded. Or I'll see if your dog can catch a .300 blackout round at 2,000 feet per second. Derek froze. The water was swirling around his waist, the cold seeping into his bones. He looked at Havoc. The dog was 30 yards away, exhausted, standing in the open. He looked at the log, where the silver gleam of the mylar blanket was visible to anyone with a clear line of sight. He was out of tricks. He was out of improvised bombs. And he was out of time. The de Havilland Beaver's engine roared to life, the prop wash throwing a wall of spray into Derek's face. The plane began to move, the floats slicing through the water. The gun, Derek, Sophia repeated, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. Now, or the girl dies first, then the dog, then you. Derek looked at his Glock. He looked at the girl who had played the part of a victim so perfectly that even a Special Forces medic had been fooled. He realized then that the HELP sign hadn't been written for him. It had been written by her. He slowly raised his hands, the pistol dangling from his trigger finger by the guard. Don't hurt the dog, Derek whispered, a sound that was lost in the roar of the engine. Sophia smiled. It was the last thing Derek saw before the world dissolved into a blinding spray of white water and the deafening, final scream of the trap closing tight. The dawn was no longer a promise. It was a cold gray reality that stripped the shadows from the beach, leaving only the raw, jagged truth of the standoff. The de Havilland Beaver's radial engine roared, a rhythmic mechanical scream that churned the shallow water into a frothing cauldron of white foam. The prop wash was a physical wall, stinging Derek's eyes with salt and sand, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. The geometry of the beach had become a lethal equation. Sophia, the girl who had played the traumatized daughter with terrifying precision, stood on the left float of the plane. She held the suppressed MCX Rattler with the casual, high-ready stance of a person who had been born with a rifle in her hand. Her aim was fixed on the cedar log 30 yards away, where Maya lay shivering and where Havoc stood as the final line of defense. Derek stood waist-deep in the surging tide, his Glock 19 leveled at Elena. The mother was caught in the middle, kneeling on the float between Derek's barrel and Sophia's position. It was a Mexican standoff where the stakes weren't just lives, but the very nature of the souls involved. Drop it, Derek, Sophia shouted over the engine's drone. Her voice was flat, devoid of the jagged edge of adrenaline. She was a professional at the height of her power. You've seen how this ends. You've lived this movie before. Don't make me pull the trigger on the girl. Elena looked at Derek, her blonde hair whipped into a frenzy by the propeller. Even now, with a 9mm round inches from her chest, she didn't look afraid. She looked at him with a predatory pity that was more insulting than a blade. She's right, Derek, Elena said, her voice cutting through the mechanical roar. Think about the optics. Think about the memory. You're the man who saves people, aren't you? That's your whole brand. That's why you're here. That's why you fly these lonely routes, pretending the noise of the engine can drown out the sound of Marcus screaming. Derek's finger tightened on the trigger, the slack taken up. The mention of Marcus was like a physical blow to his solar plexus. Don't say his name. Why not? Elena leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, her mask of maternal warmth long gone, replaced by the cold, analytical gaze of a psychological profiler. We know why you didn't jump that day in Kandahar. We know you followed the rules while your friend died in the dirt. You've been running from that cowardice for 3 years, trying to buy your way into heaven one rescue at a time. But look at you now. You're standing in the water, holding a gun on a woman, while another girl is in the crosshairs because of your ego. Derek felt the familiar, cold weight of his trauma pressing down on him. The guilt was a heavy, liquid thing, filling his lungs, making it hard to breathe. She's right, the voice in the back of his head whispered. You're going to fail again. You're going to watch them die, because you can't make the hard choice. You couldn't save Marcus, Elena continued, her voice dropping into a conversational, almost intimate tone that bypassed his defenses. Will you let another woman die today? Is your pride worth Maya's life? Just give us the plane. Let Sophia lower the rifle. We'll take the girl, we'll leave the island, and you can go back to your quiet life. You can tell yourself you had no choice. You're good at that, aren't you? Convincing yourself that the rules saved you. The engine's roar seemed to grow louder, a cacophony of doubt and memory. But as the spray hit Derek's face, a single sharp detail pierced through the psychological fog. How did she know? He hadn't mentioned Marcus to them. He hadn't talked about his service record or the specific nature of the botched extraction. In the civilian world, he was just Derek the pilot. Even his flight logs didn't contain the names of the dead. The realization hit him with the force of a high-velocity round. This wasn't a random encounter. It wasn't just a trap for any pilot. "You didn't just find me," Derek said, his voice suddenly calm, the tremor in his hands vanishing as the savior mask finally shattered, leaving only the operator underneath. "This wasn't a lucky catch. You researched the routes. You looked for pilots with specific psychological profiles. You looked for the ones with a savior complex, the ones who were wounded, the ones who would ignore a dog's warning because they needed to believe in the victim more than they needed to believe in the truth." Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Psychology is the ultimate force multiplier, Derek. We didn't need to hunt you. We just needed to build a mirror that reflected your own guilt back at you. You flew right into it. This entire operation," Derek gestured with the gun toward the help stones, "was built for me. The stones, the timing, the mother and daughter act. You knew I couldn't walk away from a child in shock. You weaponized my best friend's death against me. And it worked," Sophia called out from the cockpit. "It worked perfectly until your dog started thinking for you. Now drop the gun, or the girl dies." Derek looked at Havoc. The dog was still 30 yards away, his body pressed against the log, his ears back. He was waiting. He wasn't confused by the words. He wasn't burdened by the past. He was simply waiting for the alpha to make a decision. In that moment, the reckoning finally arrived. Derek realized that Elena's manipulation only worked if he remained the man who was defined by his failure. If he remained the medic who followed protocol to avoid the pain of choice. But he wasn't that man anymore. Havoc had known it from the moment they circled the island. The dog didn't care about Marcus. The dog didn't care about what victims should look like. The dog saw predators, and he had been trying to tell Derek that the only way to save the innocent was to destroy the threat. Derek shifted his weight in the water, his feet finding purchase on the submerged rocks. He focused on the front sight post of his Glock. He didn't look at Elena's eyes. He looked at the mechanical junction of the aircraft's float and the strut. "You're right about one thing, Elena," Derek said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "I couldn't save my friend. But I'm not that man anymore. I'm the man who's going to stop you." "Derek, no!" Elena screamed, seeing the change in his eyes. Sophia's finger began to squeeze the trigger of the MCX Rattler. Derek didn't fire at Elena. He didn't fire at Sophia. He shifted his POA, point of aim, by 3 inches, and fired 2 rapid shots at the left float's rear bracing wire. The heavy 9mm rounds, fired at close range, snapped the high-tension steel cable. The float, already under immense pressure from the engine's torque and the surging tide, buckled. The left wing of the Beaver dipped violently toward the water as the structural integrity of the landing gear failed. The sudden, violent lurch threw Sophia off balance. Her rifle barked, a burst of .300 blackout rounds, chewing into the sand 5 feet wide of the cedar log. "Havoc! Work! Attack!" Derek roared. The Malinois didn't hesitate. He didn't run along the beach. He launched himself directly into the surf, his powerful legs churning the water as he closed the distance to the plane in a blur of black and tan. Elena tried to stand, reaching for a concealed backup weapon in her vest, but the dipping wing had pinned her against the fuselage. Derek surged forward through the waist-deep water, firing a 3rd shot. This one wasn't for the plane. He aimed at the hand Sophia had on the forestock of her rifle. The bullet shattered the polymer guard, the kinetic impact spinning the rifle out of the girl's hands and into the deep water. Sophia let out a snarl of rage, reaching for a sidearm, but Havoc was already there. The dog didn't go for the floats. He used the dipping wing as a ramp, launching himself 5 feet through the air and colliding with Elena on the float. The impact was brutal. Havoc's 70 pounds of muscle slammed into Elena's chest, the dog's jaws locking onto the thick nylon of her tactical vest and dragging her down into the churning white water wake of the propeller. "No!" Sophia screamed, diving toward her mother. Derek reached the plane, grabbing the door frame and hauling himself up. He shoved the barrel of his Glock into the cockpit, directly under Sophia's chin. "Don't," Derek said, his voice as cold as the Pacific. "The dog is faster than you, and I'm much, much angrier." Sophia froze. Her hand was inches from a holstered pistol, but the cold steel of the Glock against her throat was a definitive argument. She looked at Derek, and for the first time, the deadness in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of genuine, human fear. Below them, Elena was struggling in the water, Havoc keeping a death grip on her shoulder, pulling her away from the spinning blades of the propeller. The dog was a master of his craft. He wasn't killing her. He was neutralizing her, using his weight to keep her submerged just enough to sap her strength. The roar of the Beaver's engine suddenly felt distant, eclipsed by a new sound. A rhythmic thumping beat began to vibrate through the air, vibrating the very surface of the water. from the gray veil of the northern horizon, a splash of bright, fluorescent orange appeared. The Jayhawk, the real Coast Guard. The helicopter swept over the ridgeline, its searchlight cutting through the mist, illuminating the wreckage of the plane, and the crippled plane bobbing in the surf like a broken toy. "Drop it," Derek commanded Sophia. "Everything. Now." The girl slowly unbuckled her belt and let her sidearm fall into the water. She sat back in the seat, her hands raised, her expression returning to that vacant, chilling mask. Derek kept his weapon trained on her until the first Coast Guard swimmer hit the water, the orange-clad figure sprinting through the surf with a rifle leveled. "Clear," the swimmer shouted. "Secure the pilot. Get the dog." 10 minutes later, the beach was a swarm of activity. 3 more Coast Guard personnel had landed, securing the 2 contractors Derek had incapacitated earlier, and taking Elena and Sophia into custody. Maya was being treated by a flight medic, wrapped in real wool blankets, her eyes finally beginning to track the movement of the rescuers. Derek sat on the edge of the quartz stones, his wet clothes clinging to him, his body shaking with the onset of a massive adrenaline dump. Havoc sat beside him, his fur matted and salty, his head resting on Derek's thigh. The dog was calm now, his work done. Elena was being led toward the transport basket, her hands zip-tied behind her back. As she passed Derek, she stopped. The Coast Guard guard tried to nudge her forward, but she resisted, looking at Derek with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You think this is a victory, Derek?" She spat, her voice raspy from the salt water. "You think you've redeemed yourself? You're still a killer. You still chose to destroy your plane and risk that girl's life, just to win a game you didn't even know you were playing. You'll never know if you did the right thing. You'll spend every night wondering if Marcus would have wanted this blood on your hands." Derek looked up at her. He looked at the woman who had tried to turn his soul into a weapon. He looked at the girl Sophia, who was being loaded into the basket next to her, already looking for the next angle, the next mask. Then he looked at Havoc. The dog looked back, his amber eyes clear, steady, and full of an ancient, uncomplicated wisdom. Havoc didn't have a past to regret, or a future to fear. He lived in the truth of the moment. And in that moment, the truth was that Maya was alive, the predators were in chains, and the cycle of guilt had finally been broken. "Yes, I will," Derek said, his voice steady, carrying over the wind. "I'll know exactly if I did the right thing. Because my dog knew the truth from the second we saw your sign, and for the first time in 3 years, I'm finally smart enough to listen to him." Elena opened her mouth to speak, but the guard shoved her forward, and she was hoisted into the air, disappearing into the belly of the orange helicopter. Derek watched the Jayhawk bank and turn, heading back toward Astoria. The silence that followed was profound. The engine of the Beaver was dead, the plane resting lopsided in the sand, its mission over. He reached down and scratched Havoc behind the ears, the dog's tail giving a single slow wag against the quartz stones. "Let's go home, partner," Derek whispered. "I think we've saved enough people for one day." The sun finally broke through the clouds, a golden spear that turned the gray Pacific into a field of diamonds. As Derek stood up and began the long walk toward the rescue boat, he didn't look back at the HELP sign. He didn't need to. The words were just stones. But the man walking away from them, and the dog at his side, were finally, truly free. The roar of the Coast Guard Jayhawk gradually faded into a rhythmic, distant thrum as it banked toward the mainland, leaving a strange, ringing silence in its wake. On the sands of Phantom Ridge, the chaos of the last hour was being methodically disassembled by a secondary boarding team from a nearby cutter. The morning sun had finally clawed its way through the Pacific mist, casting long golden shadows across the sign that had nearly been Derek Halston's headstone. Derek stood by the water's edge, his boots sinking into the wet slurry of the rising tide. He watched as Elena and Sophia were led toward a high-speed interceptor boat. Even in tactical zip ties, Elena walked with a defiant, feline grace. She didn't look back. Sophia, however, stopped at the gangplank. She turned her head, her gaze locking onto Derek with a cold, predatory curiosity that suggested she was already memorizing his face for a future encounter. There was no remorse in her eyes, only the clinical assessment of a failed mission. "They're a special kind of poison, aren't they?" Derek turned to see Special Agent Miller, a weathered man in a Coast Guard tactical law enforcement vest, holding a digital tablet and a cup of lukewarm thermos coffee. "They're professionals," Derek replied, his voice sounding thin and raspy to his own ears. "I've seen insurgents in the Helmand province with less discipline than that girl." Miller nodded, looking out at the crippled de Havilland Beaver resting lopsided in the shallows. "You have no idea what you just stepped into, Halston. We've been tracking this cell, internally we called them the Sirens, for nearly 24 months. They've disappeared 6 high-value bush planes and 4 private yachts between here and the Alaskan Panhandle. Every time, we found the vessels stripped and repainted in international waters, but we never found the crews. Not a single survivor. Until today, Derek felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the salt spray. 4 years of this. At least, Miller said, tapping his tablet. They didn't just pick random targets. They had access to flight insurance databases, veteran hospital records, even social media. They looked for the good Samaritans. Pilots like you. Experienced, solo, and burdened with enough conscience to ignore a red flag if it meant saving a life. They researched your friend Marcus, Derek. They knew exactly which buttons to press to make sure you'd land that plane without asking too many questions. Derek looked at Havoc, who was currently receiving a celebratory ear scratch from a young Coast Guard ensign. The dog looked bored, his task finished, his intensity replaced by a calm, watchful dignity. I gave my statement to your recorders, Derek said. But I'm telling you now, Agent, if you want to know how I broke the ring, it wasn't my training. It was the dog. He knew before the wheels even touched the water. He saw through the melange, the acting, and the psychological profiling. He didn't see a mother and daughter. He saw 2 apex predators waiting in a blind. Miller looked at Havoc with newfound respect. We've seen it before with working dogs, but rarely with this much clarity. You're lucky you listened to him. Most guys in your position would have muzzled the dog and walked right into the kill zone. I almost did, Derek admitted, the weight of the confession heavy in his chest. I almost chose my guilt over his instinct. Nearby, a medical evacuation team was hoisting Maya into the final transport. She was sitting up now, her face pale, but her eyes focused. As she passed Derek, she reached out a trembling hand. He took it, feeling the faint, frantic pulse in her wrist. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. They told me no one was coming. They told me the world had forgotten I existed. Not today, Maya, Derek said softly. You're going home. He watched her disappear into the helicopter, a sense of quiet closure settling over him. For years he had tried to save Marcus by saving everyone else. He had treated his life like a mathematical equation. If he rescued enough strangers, the sum would eventually equal the one man he'd lost. But as the Jayhawk turned into a speck on the horizon, he realized the math was wrong. You couldn't balance a life with a number. You could only honor the dead by living with the wisdom they'd paid for. The Coast Guard team offered him a lift, but Derek shook his head. He had work to do. He spent the next 3 hours with a salvage crew, righting the beaver and patching the float with emergency resin. It wouldn't be pretty, and the airframe would need a total overhaul back in Astoria, but she was still airworthy. He wouldn't leave his partner, the plane, behind on this haunted rock. Finally, the island was empty. The tactical teams were gone, the Elp stones were being scattered by the incoming tide, and the only sound left was the crying of the gulls and the rhythmic lap of the Pacific. Derek sat on a piece of driftwood, Havoc sitting stoically by his side. The dog leaned his weight against Derek's leg, a warm, solid presence in the cooling afternoon. You tried to tell me, didn't you? Derek whispered, his hand finding the soft fur behind Havoc's ears. From the very first circle, you knew the air was wrong. You knew the silence was fake. Havoc let out a soft huff, his tail giving a single slow thump against the sand. I spent so much time trying to be the hero that I forgot how to be a partner, Derek continued. I thought my compassion was my strength, but it was just a blindfold. Elena saw that blindfold from a mile away. She almost used it to hang us both. He looked out at the ocean, the vast gray expanse that had claimed so many. He thought of Marcus. For the first time in years, the memory of his friend didn't feel like a lead weight. It felt like a warning, a quiet, steady voice telling him to stay sharp. Marcus hadn't died so that Derek could be a martyr. He had died so that Derek could learn. Wisdom, Derek murmured. That's the only thing the dead leave us. Everything else is just noise. He stood up and whistled. Havoc bounded toward the plane, his energy returning as he sensed the journey home. They climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of aviation fuel and old leather greeting them like an old friend. Derek went through the pre-flight checklist, but he did it differently this time. He didn't just check the dials. He checked the horizon. He checked the shadows. He taxied the beaver out of the cove, the patched float holding steady against the swells. As the engine roared to life, the deep, resonating thrum filled the cabin. But it wasn't a shield anymore. It was a tool. The flight back to Astoria followed the same coastline, the same altitude, and the same grid lines as the flight out. But the man at the controls was fundamentally changed. The compulsive need to save the world had been replaced by a tactical discernment. He was still a rescuer. He would always be a medic at heart, but he was no longer a victim of his own empathy. As they neared the mainland, the radio crackled to life. It was the Astoria dispatcher, her voice a welcome bit of normalcy. Beaver, November 47 Alpha, Astoria Flight Service. We have a report of a possible capsized skiff near Nehalem Bay. One occupant reported in the water. Are you available for a visual recon? In the past, Derek would have slammed the yoke over without a second thought, his heart racing with the desperate need to be the first on the scene. He He would have ignored the weather, the fuel levels, or his own exhaustion. He looked over at Havoc. The dog was sitting upright, his ears forward, his gaze fixed on the water below. He wasn't growling. He wasn't whining. He was calm. His body relaxed, his tail giving a gentle wag. He looked at Derek and let out a short, encouraging, "Yep." Derek keyed the mic, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. "Astoria, this is 7 Alpha. Copy the report. We are in the area and available for recon." He adjusted the trim, but his mind was already formulating the new protocol. From this day forward, the missions wouldn't be dictated by his guilt or a set of stones on a beach. They would be dictated by the partnership. If Havoc says no, the answer is no. Derek whispered to the cockpit. He realized now that saving lives wasn't about saying yes to everyone who cried for help. It was about having the wisdom to know the difference between a soul in need and a trap in waiting. It was about knowing that true heroism required eyes that could see the darkness, even when it was wrapped in a mother's smile. He reached over and placed his hand on Havoc's head, the dog leaning into the touch. "You're the real hero, partner," Derek said. "I just drive the bus." The radio crackled again. 7 Alpha. Be advised, the occupant is signaling with a mirror. They appear to be clinging to the hull. Derek looked back at Havoc. The dog remained calm, his amber eyes clear and steady. He looked at the water where a tiny, genuine flash of light was pulsing against the dark blue of the bay. "This one's real, boy," Derek said, his voice firm and certain. "Let's go." The de Havilland Beaver banked sharply, the silver wings catching the last of the afternoon light as it dove toward the horizon. They were still flying for redemption, but they were no longer flying alone. The shadows of the past were behind them, and for the first time in a very long time, Derek Halston was looking exactly where he needed to be. Straight ahead. Havoc didn't hesitate when it mattered most. He stood between a killer and his master, trusting that someone would eventually hear their signal. Derek finally learned to trust his partner. Will you? Havoc is still standing watch, waiting for you to join the crew. Subscribe now so we don't leave a hero behind. If you think a dog's loyalty is the strongest force on earth, hit that like button, and comment "I hear you" below. Don't let their story end in silence.